Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
So, it's a great pleasure to be able to have a chance to talk to Pat Bateson, who I've known for many years. Pat, where were you born and when?
I was born in 1938 on the Chiltern Hills. My parents had bought a little plot of land. They didn't have very much money, but they got this plot of land for about £100, I think, which was stuck out on the escarpment of the Chilterns. And my father designed the house, and he was at that time, he wasn't really an architect, he was a wood drying expert, and he panelled the whole house with plywood. And my parents' friends used to tease them about it and sort of say it would be like living in a packing case. But actually it was a lovely house. It was very, very warm, nice house. Rather low ceilings, in fact. I mean, they were really about sort of 6'5" or something like that. You know, I mean, they wouldn't be allowed these days. But it was a very, very nice house. Anyway, I was born in the house, and I had an older brother, 5 years older, and that's where I started.
That's where you started. Tell me something about your family. I mean, since the kinship is rather important further back, you can start at least a grandparents' generation.
Well, I mean, I had a very distinguished biologist relative, William Bateson, who was in fact a cousin of my grandfather, and he, as I think most people know, he coined the term genetics, because he had been working on inheritance for a long time, and then Mendel's material became available. He didn't know about it until the end of the 19th century, and then suddenly he realised how important Mendel's work was, and then became a sort of champion of Mendel. And anyway, William Bateson was sort of a figure in the family who I never knew, because he died 12 years before I was born. But he was clearly a figure that everybody in the family kind of knew about.
He lived in Cambridge, didn't he? I mean,
he lived in Cambridge for a while. He was professor of biology here for a while, and then he became director of the John Innes Institute, which was in London at that time. And then later on it moved to Norwich.
And you worked on peas, or did he? Or
no, that was really kind of Mendel's work. I mean, Mendel's work was famously on peas. No, he worked on plants, but he also worked on animals. He had a lot of work on chickens, and he was very prolific actually, and really got the whole subject of genetics going. And he was sort of fiercely opposed by a kind of group of mathematicians called biometricians, and one of his greatest friends he kind of attacked him when he produced a book at the end of the 19th century called Materials for the Study of Variation, and this man attacked him, and Willie was terribly upset about this, and he felt he was being really let down. Anyway, so there was this great feud between them, which to a certain extent continues to this day. I mean, you still sort of find this kind of battle going on. Anyway, he was a kind of role model, even though I never met the role model.
That's why you went around saying, "I'm going to be a biologist."
I'm going to be a biologist, having not a clue what it meant. But I was fascinated by the subject. I can remember sort of, the natural history lessons we had when I was a small boy. I mean, we used to sort of trundle across to a school during the war. I mean, it was wonderful actually. When you think of how children now are sort of taken to school in 4x4s, at that time we always used to walk sort of about 3 or 4 miles to school. Anyway, we had very good teachers there, and there was a very good natural history woman who taught me.
Do you remember her name?
She was called Mrs. Truscott.
This is at your first school, is it?
This was kind of, I don't know, what would you call it? I mean, it wasn't really a kind of, it wasn't a primary school in the official sense of the word. It was a privately run school, but all the children, all the local children went there.
This was in the Chilterns or in London?
This is on the Chilterns. I mean,
still.
I mean, I spent all the war years living on the Chilterns, and we had a whole lot of children in the house because my mother was Norwegian, and as a result of that, we got quite a lot of Norwegian evacuees, and there were two, a boy and a girl, Mons and Bente Lee, who really are still very dear friends, and I still see them, and they were there really all the way through from when Norway was invaded until the end of the war. So they were there. And then another one who you probably know, Karen Spark Jones was, was
computer scientist.
Yes, and she lived with us, and there were various other people who came and went. So we had a kind of house full, and it was a very happy childhood actually. I mean,
what were your parents like? I mean,
my mother was extraordinarily vivacious and very. Everybody loved her. She was a kind of very, very attractive woman. My father also, I mean, I hardly knew him. You know, it was rather awful because I mean, I didn't know him from before the war because he went off to the war and then he was wounded at Dunkirk and captured, and in all the war years he was in the prisoner of war camp. So I didn't know him, but I used to write to him. And one of the cards which I sent him during the war was a picture of a gibbet with a man hanging from it, and it said, I hope the Germans don't hang you because I love you.
Hero card.
and this somehow got through the censors.
You didn't see him till you were 8?
Didn't see it till the end of the war, and then I mean he wasn't really very well when he came back, and he lived for another 10 years. And, he had a stroke 10 years later, and then died sort of after that. So I didn't know him for very long.
What was his occupation?
He'd been a sort of expert in timber drying when he before the war, and then during the war he took a degree in architecture, and when he came back he was
in the prisoner of war camp.
Yeah, yes, they did quite good things, I think.
Yeah.
But he was a man of great charm, actually. I mean, and unfortunately, I didn't sort of really see as much of that as I would have liked to have done in retrospect, because he was a very sweet man, in fact. And he had it was interesting. He had a brother who was Don at Oxford, F.W. Bateson, who was English literary critic and great opponent of Lewis. And there was actually quite a funny story about that, which was that. Freddie, as he was called, went to a meeting in somewhere in the States, and they said to him when he registered, "Oh, we've got a room for you and Mrs. Levis." And of course, they were absolutely
Queenish.
Anyway, the Levisites were furious about this, but actually, apparently, it was true.
Is part of the clan extend to the anthropologist? Bateson?
Yes, of course.
Gregory.
I mean, the only surviving son of Willie Bateson was Gregory. And I didn't meet Gregory until I was a graduate student, in fact. Robert Hind had been involved in a conference in Berkeley. And in the second year, they were going to reconvene this conference, and every one of the senior members was invited to bring along a graduate student, and I was the one who was picked by Robert. And the organizer sent a letter to me at St John's, and I was here at King's, and St John's, they didn't know Patrick Bateson, so they assumed it must be Gregory Bateson. So the letter that went off to Gregory, who was back in California. He was living in Menlo Park at that time. And Gregory got this invitation and said, yes, he'd love to come. And the man who was organising it, Frank Beach, wasn't a great admirer of Gregory and wasn't very pleased with Gregory. And thus got invited. But anyway, I eventually did get the invitation, and so before the conference started, I went to spend a night with Gregory, and it was rather strange because my father was by that time dead, and Gregory was astonishingly like him. I mean, it was a very, very close sort of family likeness, actually, even though they were second cousins. And it was a very, very remarkable example of that. Actually, it's something that still people don't properly understand, is how you get these sort of extraordinary family likenesses, even though the genetic relatedness is not very great. Anyway, so I met Gregory, and Gregory at that time was living in Menlo Park, and he had on his wall absolutely magnificent Blakes, I mean, which I think are now. Some of them went to the Tate, but I think I'm not sure whether there was a wonderful picture which he had. Anyway, so I met Gregory for the first time, and then saw quite a lot of him after that.
What sort of man was he?
Powerful, curiously kind of inarticulate man in some ways. I mean, but very. He had a way of words which some people found absolutely lovely and other people hated. I mean, he coined terms all the time.
Schizogenesis
and he had a kind of cult following in California because of this. And he wrote a book called Steps to the Ecology of Mind, which you know, I think it's a dreadful book actually, but they loved him, and he had all these hippies sort of flocking around him. He took it all as a bit of a joke actually. It was rather funny that he was sort of treated as a kind of cult figure.
You didn't meet Margaret Mead, one of his
I
wives.
did actually, yes, but not in connection with Gregory. But I mean, I met her at a conference, and she was quite. I think she was rather taken with me, because you know, here was a sort of younger version of Gregory, sort of, you know, appearing, and we kind of rather flirted with me, so it was quite funny.
She must have been a lot older than you at that time.
Oh yes, I mean.
And she was very small.
She was quite small, but she was quite vivacious actually,
Again, an impressive mind, I suppose.
Oh yeah, and a very sort of dominant figure in a way. I mean, she kind of bullied people a bit. And so did Gregory actually, although I don't think he really meant it, but he did. But yes, so I had astrological connections.
Yeah, right from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Let's come back to your schooling. You, after this first school.
Then I went to a prep school down in Sussex for 5 years, and I really didn't like it to begin with. I remember sort of you know, it was the first time I was away from home, and sort of being sent off as a boarder at sort of at 8.
What school was it?
It was just called school. It was a little school called Normansell, which was one of the many prep schools in
Sussex,
near Seaford. And actually, I think it was in many ways it was quite a good school. I mean, I learned a lot there, but certainly in the early period, I felt very, very upset being sort of yanked out of a very happy home, and I think it became rather shy as a result. You know, in the way that many kind of British children do when they're sort of yanked out of their homes, stuck in a kind of boarding school at the age of 8. That's far too young, really. But eventually, you know, I settled down and had a happy time there. And then from there, I went to Westminster, and then I was initially I was a day boy at Westminster, because by that time my parents were living with William Bateson's brother, who was by then a widower, and he lived in Chelsea, and my parents looked after him. so I got to know him very well. But anyway, I would go. The first year I was a day boy. I went to Westminster, and then that was slightly unsatisfactory. So I became a sort of weekly boarder. You lose out a lot if you're a day boy at a big school like that. So for the first year I was at the day boy, but then I became a weekly boarder, initially sort of not doing particularly well academically. I mean, I was sort of I still sort of slightly affected by that sort of early experience of being, yanked away from home. But I kind of rose steadily up while I was there, and by the end sort of was in the sort of top sets, and then started to do biology, which I loved. It was marvellous to finally sort of do what I really wanted to do.
What age was that?
That was, I was 16, I guess, when I started to do the specialise in biology. And at the same time as that, because I was getting quite big by then, I was selected for the first 8. I was rowing, and I enjoyed rowing. And rather to my surprise, I was put into the first 8. So I spent 2 years in the first 8. And even then, it was hard training. I mean, we used to train every day, and it was it did take me away a bit from academic work. And I had a chemistry master who was furious. He said, "You can't serve 2 masters. You've got to either make up your mind. Either you're going to be a scientist or you're going to row." I wrote an article in my house magazine directed at this chemistry master, saying it's psychologically beneficial to have 2 masters. There's something in it actually, because I got a lot of confidence actually out of it. Because at that stage, I mean, doing well at sports did actually bring a lot of status, and I suddenly was sort of up there with the people the rest of the school admired, so although it did conflict, I mean, I'm sure it did to some extent with sort of the science. It was very good sort of from the point of view of confidence building, and so I did get a lot out of it. And at the same time as that, I was when I was 14, I started going to a bird observatory in my holidays. It was up on the Northumberland coast, and learning about migration and catching birds and putting wings on them.
How did that happen?
We had a neighbour on the Chilterns called Richard Fitter, who was well known naturalist, and I got a lot from him actually. He was very helpful and kind to me. Quite a shy man, but he really sort of he helped me along, and he suggested that I go and spend time at a sort of field studies centre, and there was this one up on the Northumberland coast, just opposite the Farne Islands. It was a lovely place, and I went back there quite a few times, and really loved it, because it was I really was sort of getting hands on with biology, and there's something extraordinary about if you catch a beautiful bird and you see it in your hand, you see just how beautiful it is. You learn much more about it than you would if you just simply saw it at a distance. Anyway, I mean, while I was there, I'd already sort of made up my mind that I wanted to do zoology, and I wanted to go to Cambridge, and there was a schoolmaster there one occasion, and he started telling me about this thing called PhD, and I hadn't a clue really what that meant. But as he described it, I thought, that sounds like heaven. It's just what I want to do. And so that really was, I can remember that moment, just when this is what I wanted to aim for.
Were there any teachers, I mean, this man or others, who particularly affect?
I had a very, very good biology master. I mean, he was a man called Lawrence Bird, who had actually taught Andrew Huxley, and remembered with great affection Andrew. he was quite getting on by then, but he was very. I found him absolutely inspiring, and you know, as for so many people, if you have one person who really takes an interest in you like that, and it makes a hell of a difference. So I really benefited from that.
And you also at some point read Apes, Angels, and Victorians.
Yes, it was actually interestingly. I looked at it again because Douche was doing his book on Emma Darwin's recipes, and in writing.
You ought to explain that Dusha is your wife.
Yes, Douche is my wife, and of course I'm very much involved in the 200th birthday of Darwin. But anyway, I looked at this book again, and it's a very good biography actually, both of Darwin and of Huxley, who was Darwin's bulldog, so-called. And I think that was the first time I really appreciated just how important Darwin was as a figure.
This was at school. You read it.
This was at school. I think I was 16 or 17 when I read that. I remember that very well as a sort of a formative thing to read. And going back to it again, I realise actually it still is a very good biography. I mean, there have been excellent biographies written since, but still, he got a lot of the quotes that you find in Janet Brown's book and the Desmond and Moore biography. And it was an excellent book.
Were there, I mean, apart from rowing, were there other things that you really, I mean, and bird watching, music or any other sports or hobbies?
Well, I mean, Westminster actually had a very kind of sort of liberated feel about it, and there was. I remember the then headmaster, Walter Hamilton, used to run a essay society, and I used to write for that and go to it, and it was actually that was very helpful in sort of learning to write well. I wrote a essay about the angry young men, and I remember Hamilton was rather sort of dour man, where he sort of didn't really understand about these radicals who were writing at that time. This was the mid-50s. And I mean, he was a very interesting man, but he was not in any way a liberal man. He was really quite conservative. Supposedly, he proposed to his wife by saying, "Would you like to have your name on my tombstone?" but anyway, there was, and I had a lot of sort of good intellectual contacts there, some of which have persisted all the way through. And I played the cello, not very well, but I did.
And does music mean much to you still?
A lot. I mean, I love music, right? I mean, but I'm more of a listener than a performer, I'm afraid. And I kept my cello for a long time after I left school, hoping that I'd be able to play with my own children. When the time came, I found I was so rusty that I finally sold it. It was.
What sort of music? I mean.
Well, I mean, it was mostly classical music. I mean, it was
and classical. I mean.
Well, I mean, I played in the school orchestra at the end, and we played Bach and Mozart. I think it was sort of nothing very kind of very advanced. Before the bass had been properly liberated, so it was quite easy actually to play the cello in those days with that music.
Then you did then go on to Cambridge.
Yes, I mean, I came up here for the scholarship exam. I didn't get a scholarship at that point, but I was staying in the Garden Hostel and overslept.
At King's College?
Yeah, here at King's. Oh, actually, I should mention that my old uncle Ned, who was William Bateson's brother, had been at King's. And he was very keen as I come here. And I came up with him. He was in his mid-80s by then, and he wanted to take me to his father's house, his father was Master of St John's, and he said, "I want to show you a little chestnut which I planted when my sister and I played truant and didn't go to chapel." And so we went into the garden of the Master's Lodge at St John's, and he was sort of looking around for this small chestnut. And then his eyes went up, and there was this enormous chestnut, so 100 feet high, which he suddenly realised how old he was. So, anyway, so but the main reason for coming up was for me to see kings, and I fell in love with it and very much wanted to come.
But you overslept, did you say?
When I came up for the scholarship exam, I overslept, and I ran through the college. And I met an elderly Don. I said, "Where is the Senate House?" And the Don actually I subsequently realised was Philip Radcliffe. And he kind of looked at me, it was rather blank look in his eyes. He said, "Ask a college porter." Anyway, I didn't get a scholarship. But I got a place, of course, and once I got a place, which was in December of 1955. Then I went to Norway because I had a wonderful grandfather who he was Chief Justice, had been Chief Justice, and he had been Chief Justice when the Germans invaded. And the king and the government left, but because he was left there, he became officially the government of Norway. But of course he went undercover and then ran the resistance during the war. Wasn't ever caught by the Nazis, and I think they were closing in on him, because they used to meet apparently with hoods on, so that people wouldn't know who they were. But anyway, he got away with it, and then became a great hero after the war.
What was his name?
His name was Paul Berg.
I think I've heard of his name.
He was very much alive when I left school, so I went to live with him and spent sort of that winter after I'd left school there. And I worked, he got me a place at the Natural History Museum in Oslo, and I used to go in every day and work there and sort of learn about systematics and how to skin birds. And, it was sort of, it wasn't very hard work, but it was kind of interesting for me. And then when the summer came, he introduced me to the Norsk Polar Institute, which is they run expeditions up to Spitsbergen.
How do you spell Nosh? How do you spell Nosh?
Norsk.
Norsk.
Norsk. Norwegian Polar Institute.
Yeah.
Anyway, I got a place as a deckhand doing hydrographical work, and so I went up on this expedition and spent the summer there, up in the north west part of Spitsbergen. And there were two North Norwegian fishermen working on it as well, who didn't speak a word of English, and so I kind of learnt.
Snakker du norsk?
Yeah, yes, snakker norsk. But I came back with a kind of North Norwegian accent, which my mother didn't approve of at all. But anyway, so I had massive time there for bird watching, and so I had a great time. And I was also working with them, getting my first paychecks actually. It was great. So that was a kind of taste of working in a strange, wonderful environment. Actually, very, very beautiful. Rather like sort of being in the high Alps, but sort of down at sea level, as it were. anyway, I came back and then started here at King's, and that was in October of '57. And then that winter, I went to a conference which was organised by David Lack at St Hugh's in Oxford. It was a conference for students, really, and they could talk about their own work and meet great figures. And
he was a great figure as well.
Oh, David Lack was, yes. I mean, he started life as a schoolmaster, but he wrote this famous book, The Life of the Robin, which, and he then got a place at Oxford, and in fact was Robert Hines' supervisor. So there's an interesting sort of bit of intellectual lineage there. Anyway, at that conference, Nico Tinbergen was giving a talk about gulls. He was doing a kind of comparative study of gulls. And I met, while I was there, I met a fellow Cambridge undergraduate called Chris Plowright, and he'd been to Spitsbergen as a geologist, but he wanted to. He was also an ornithologist, and we wanted to go up and look at an ivory gull, which is a very, very rare pure white gull. And we talked to Nico Tinbergen about this, and Tinbergen was very, very enthusiastic because nothing was known about the ivory gull. And a student of his, Esther Calm, who just published a brilliant paper on the adaptations of the kittiwake, which is a cliff nesting bird, cliff nesting gull. And it has all sorts of special adaptations for living on cliffs. And he was very keen that other cliff nesting gulls should be looked at. And as it turned out, I mean, the ivory gull is a cliff nesting bird, but nothing was known about it. And Tinbergen himself had spent a year in Greenland when he was a young man with his wife. Very keen to go back to the Arctic, because there's something that gets you about the Arctic. You want to go back once you've been there. And the plan was that he would sort of lead this expedition, and that was the plan all the way through until a month or two before we left for Spitsbergen. And anyway, we planned this expedition, and we recruited another two ornithologists to join us. And then, sadly, Tinbergen couldn't come because he had an ulcer, which his doctor said he couldn't risk going off for months. Because you really are absolutely cut off. I mean, you can't be contacted. Anyway, so I exploited my contacts from the previous year with the Norwegian Polar Institute, and they took us round to the fjord in the northeast part of the archipelago, where they'd been seen 30 years before. And we were dumped on an island with all our provisions, and we had two boats, and we couldn't get into the fjord because it was still full of ice. But we spent a few weeks on the island, so rather frustrated, trying to, because we couldn't get to the Gulf. And eventually, the ice cleared, we could get in, and we found these pure white gulls on a cliff about 1,000 feet up, nesting there. It was a wonderful experience. I remember it vividly. There's pure white birds sort of circling in front of this cliff, and it was so exciting to finally find them. So we lugged all our stuff up to the top of this cliff, and then had 5 weeks or so to work on them. And we filmed them and observed them, and they didn't actually have the adaptations of the kittiwake, it turned out. They had some very interesting things, but they didn't have that. But it was the first description that had ever been done of this bird. And it was a kind of real taste of doing sort of field work in a very beautiful, magnificent place. We nearly got stuck because while we were there was a blizzard, and we hunkered down inside our tents. And then the boat that was coming to pick us up came in earlier than we expected, and was searching because they didn't know where we were, because we weren't where they'd left us, where we'd been left. And they were going up and down, sort of blowing the hooter, and we didn't hear it because we were sort of up this high cliff. And then suddenly we saw this boat, and so we dashed down and sort of got to it, and we said, we're right up the top of this cliff, and they said, well, you've got to be off there in 2 hours because the ice is moving in, and if you don't get out now, you'll be stuck for the winter. So we haired up to the top of the cliff, sort of, took as much as we could, and then got back to the boat, and we got away. But then come back, and then Tinbergen was delighted with what we'd got, because nothing had been anywhere like this, and we had very good film. And I spent the next sort of few months, well, actually like 6 months really, sort of writing up all the stuff we'd done.
How did you combine that with doing an undergraduate degree at
Good question.
Cambridge?
It conflicted, and I didn't do. At the end of that second year, I got a 2-2, and I thought, my God, I'm never going to be able to do research, because I really spent a lot of time on doing these other things.
Who was George Salt your supervisor?
George was my supervisor in my first year, and he really inspired me actually, because he you would go for a supervision with George, and you'd come away wanting to read sort of 3 books, because he managed to do that to his.
He was a formidable mind, wasn't he?
Incredible mind, very, in a way, rather severe. I mean, I think a lot of fellows of King's regarded him as a bit of a curmudgeon, but he is an extremely kind man, actually. When you got to know him, he was a very, very nice man, and helped me a lot. But even so, despite George, I was doing too many other things. But anyway, come to the end of my second year, and I was done all badly, and then I thought, well, I've got to remedy this, and I started doing final year zoology, which was wonderful. I just loved it. Now I could concentrate on what I wanted to do, and
was there anyone who taught you then who was particularly influential?
well, interestingly, Donald Parry was one of the people teaching then. There was a man called John Pringle, who was a muscle physiologist who went subsequently to be professor of zoology at Oxford. He very much wanted me to come and do research with him, and I used to say, I'm committed to going to doing a DPhil with Tinbergen. And he said, don't do behaviour, you can do it in your holidays. You know? But anyway, I stuck to my guns.
What about Donald as a man? And I mean, he was a very kind man too.
Extraordinarily kind man. I mean, not a very good teacher actually. I mean, he was he couldn't really sort of get it across for some interesting reason. I loved his supervisions actually, because he would talk about going. He used to go down to the Antarctic after looking after whales, and it was marvellous to hear him talk about that. But he wasn't very good at actually teaching zoology, but an enormously attractive man, and subsequently became a very great friend, of course. I was very, very fond of him. But anyway, so then I really got my head down and worked very hard, and then somewhat to my surprise, I got the only first actually in that year, even though it has a very distinguished zoologist in it, people became very distinguished later on. And then George Salt said, when I got a first and got the sort of university prize, he said, look, you should aim for a research fellowship, and you're much more likely to get a research fellowship if you stay in King's. And by that time I had sort of met Robert Hine, and Robert was very willing to supervise me, but he didn't want to get him, he didn't want to lose his friendship with Nico Tinbergen, and it was quite delicate actually, because Tinbergen was expecting me to come and work with him. and Robert rang him up, and eventually Nico Tinbergen understood, and so I stayed on here in Cambridge.
What was Robert doing then? Was he a fellow of another college, or?
He was a fellow of St John's. I mean,
Already.
I think he was steward of St John's at that point. But fairly shortly after that, he got a Royal Society Service Professorship, and that's what really made him. I mean, he'd come back to Cambridge from Oxford as the person who would sort of look after the field station which Bill Thorpe had set up at Manningham. And Thorpe, who was rather kind of shy man, but very determined, sort of started to build his own little empire, and much to the annoyance of James Gray, who was Professor of Zoology, but anyway, Thorpe went ahead, got money for a lab, and while I was, my first year as a graduate student out there, this new lab went up, and it changed its name from being the Ornithological Field Station and became the sub-department of animal behaviour, which is now still is. Anyway.
Shall we go back to Robert, because
yes,
I've done an interview with Robert, and also you've been friends for many years. There is this, from my experience, this double Robert. I mean, very quite diffident, gentle exterior, and yet there is also this formidable reputation of someone who tears people to pieces and reduces Jane Goodall to tears and the rest of it. Which is the real Robert? Or are they both Robert?
Well, they're both Robert. I mean, he's got a very sharp mind, and he reads at an astonishing rate, and when I would sort of do drafts for him of chapters of my thesis, I mean, it would come back covered in comments. So I mean, he was fantastically good supervisor, but very critical. I mean, you know, he wouldn't let you get away with a badly formulated thought. I mean, what do you mean? You know? And he was like that in seminars. I mean, he had seminars in his room in St John's, and we had lots of distinguished people coming to give seminars there. And Robert just sort of tore them to pieces, and we all rather enjoyed it actually, because it was to see kind of eminent people sort of being shredded by Robert. And he was very, very unrelenting, and people who'd gone through his experience and not knowing what they were coming to told me years afterwards, you know, it was kind of the most frightening experience I'd ever had. And actually, I mean, the people who had been students there at that time learned an enormous amount from it. I mean, it was a very, very good educational experience, actually. And we also learned the tricks, as it were, you know, of being very critical. And
were Tinbergen or Lorentz the subjects of any of these?
I remember Tinbergen came to give a seminar, and he was treated completely differently by Robert. Robert was a very old friend, but also, you know, had a very high respect for him. And it was a very, very nice seminar, I remember, because Tinbergen had made this very clear distinction between kind of different kinds of questions you can ask about behaviour, or by any aspect of biology, really. I mean, you can ask about how it works, you can ask about how it develops, you can ask about what its function is, or you can ask how it evolved. And it was very important to sort those out, because people were constantly muddling them up, and apparently answering one question when they were actually answering another one. Anyway, I remember vividly on that occasion, Tinbergen had been talking about his work where he was looking at the reason why gulls take away the eggshell from the nest, and he formulated several possible reasons why they might do this. But then he went on to do an experiment in which he had dummy nests, and he put open eggshell alongside these nests, or varying distances away. And the greater the distance away from the nest to the eggshell was, the lower the chances of the dummy nest being preyed upon by crows and hedgehogs. And so he suggested that the reason why they removed this the eggshell was to lower the risk of predation on the unhatched eggs. And it was a lovely way of sort of starting to show how you could look at the functional significance of a behaviour pattern. And it was really kind of one of the first attempts to do that, to look at it experimentally. But anyway, I remember at the seminar, he made the point, which I think was still not properly understood by some people, and that is that if you know what the current function of something is, doesn't necessarily tell you why it evolved. And he was very clear about that. He said it could be that the gulls that he was working on, the black-eared gulls, which he said it could be that when this habit evolved, they were then nesting in marshes, where the presence of an egg might have actually encouraged disease. And so it might have been a very different reason why
You mean an eggshell or an egg?
An eggshell,
Yes.
an open eggshell with,
Yeah.
with membranes inside
Yeah.
it, which could be a source of infection,
Yeah.
could then infect the other chicks when they hatched out. And so he said it's possible that this behaviour pattern, which evolved for one reason, then got co-opted for another reason later in the evolution.
Mm-hmm.
And he was very clear about that, and many people have not been since.
Mm.
I mean, they still muddle up those two issues.
Mm. They do in anthropology too.
Sure.
Functionalism and historical reconstructions.
Yeah.
So that's Robert, who
Very good supervisor.
Hmm.
And
and he supervised some very distinguished people.
oh yeah, I mean, amazing.
I suppose yourself.
I mean, there are many people now sort of leaders of their fields who've been there. I mean, obviously Jane Goodall is very well known. Diane Fossey was another. And in those two cases, actually, I mean, these were people who had very little sort of by way of academic qualifications before they came here. And he really sort of got them on the road and established their reputations, and they got their PhDs as a result of his efforts. But there were people like Tim Brock and Richard Wrangham and many other figures who are now well known, who all went through Royal's hands. So he was a marvellous figure actually.
We're now at the end of your PhD. And what did you decide to do then?
Well, I felt I really wanted to understand how.
Had you got a research fellowship at King's?
No, not at that point. I mean, I applied for a Harkness fellowship and got one to go to California. And I wanted to work on the kind of mechanisms of behaviour. And I went to the lab of a man called Carl Pribram, who was a neurosurgeon and neuropsychologist, and quite different from Robert. I mean, he just loved ideas and constantly sort of coming up with kind of wild theories for this and that. But also a very good neurosurgeon and experimentalist. And anyway, I went there because I wanted to sort of I was interested in sort of trying to get at the neural basis of behaviour. And spent 2 years there. The most that I got out of it was sort of kind of a rather liberating way of thinking about theory, really. I mean, because Roberts was actually rather anti-theoretical in a way. He kind of wants to just collect a lot of data, and then somehow the theory will emerge from the data. Whereas Carl Pribram was much more kind of the other way around. I mean, the data followed from the theory, and I think actually he was probably more nearly correct than Robert in that respect. And I mean, one of the kind of really rather interesting things that came out of that was partly the kind of interest in mechanism, but also partly an experiment which I did, which was to put in monkeys' cages illuminated panels. They were letters. And they were exposed to these letters for some time. And then they were taken over to some apparatus where they could actually press panels which had the letters coming up on them. And if they got the right one, then they got a peanut, and if they got the wrong one, they got nothing. And so they were being trained to discriminate between these letters in this apparatus. And what I discovered, which was completely new, nobody had realised this before, was that if the monkey had seen one of the letters fall, then of course it learnt the thing very quickly. I mean, it had benefited from its previous experience. If it had seen two of them, and it had to discriminate between two familiar letters which it had seen in its cage, then they took much longer to learn the discrimination than animals that had never seen them before. So in the sense that they kind of classified them together, treating them as though they were the same thing. And then when you asked them to discriminate between them, they had to then, as it were, unlearn that before they could actually learn the discrimination. And this was new, and it hadn't been discovered before. And that actually then became the subject of the work of one of my graduate students when I came back to Cambridge, where I resumed work on behavioural imprinting, which I'd done for a PhD, and then when I came back to Cambridge I did that. While I was in California, I submitted a dissertation to King's and got a research fellowship. So I heard from Noel Allen, who was provost at the time, that I got this fellowship, and I can remember Dusha, my wife, and I sort of just couldn't believe this. So let's go and have a picnic on the hills. And so we got a bottle of wine and got some food, and we sort of went up and had a lovely afternoon, sort of celebrating in the hills above Stanford. But no, I mean it was that was a very exciting moment for me, because and actually it changed the whole course of my subsequent life. With that research fellowship, I could come back to King's.
Was this a JR junior research?
Junior research fellowship,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah. In what year was this?
That was in 1964, and it was fun. I mean, that summer, I mean, we were still in California. I had to interrupt the work I was doing because the Harkness insisted that we spend 3 months travelling around the States. They gave us a car, and the deal was you had to sort of travel to all the main regions of the States. And I remember at the time I was a bit sort of fed up about this, because I wanted to get on with my experiment, and it was really exciting, and I wanted to do that. But we had to go off on this trip, and of course we had a wonderful trip. I mean, we camped in wonderful places. We met lots of very lovely people, and it was an extraordinary 3 months. And of course we dined out for years afterwards. but that was sort of that was an interruption to research. And then my final year in California, we just went on doing what I'd done before. And we had lots of lovely friends there. It was a very, very, very nice time. I mean, we just got married before we left for California, so it was kind of extended honeymoon, really. So anyway, finally coming back to Cambridge, and I had a job lined up for me at Mallingham as well. So
was it a sub-department by now?
It was a sub-department, and I became senior assistant in research, and had the responsibility of looking after the sort of day-to-day administration, which I wasn't very good at. I was given that job. Rob was only too glad to get rid of it.
He was your boss, was he, Robert?
Well, actually, Bill Thorpe was my boss, really. And Robert, by that time, got a Ross Satie research professorship. And fairly soon after that, he became director of an MRC unit, which was enclosed within the sub-department. And so, in due course, I would run the sub-department and Robert would run the unit, and we sort of, we ran the place together, really. So anyway, so I came back, and I decided that I was to resume some of the work that I've been doing on behavioural imprinting, which I'd done for a PhD, and it was just at about that time that I was coming into King's for a dinner. And as you know, when you come into, you're never quite sure who you're going to sit next to. And I sat next to this delightful man who was a neuroscientist and working in the anatomy department, and discovered that he was very interested in the neural basis of learning. We got talking, and I said, look, imprinting would be a wonderful subject for this kind of research, because here you have an animal that's had no visual experience up to the time, and it suddenly becomes very ready to learn. And it would be a very good model, really, for looking at the neural basis of learning. And Gabriel, as it was Gabriel Horn, who I was sitting next to, agreed, and that started off a long period of collaboration, which you know about. I mean, it was an extraordinary kind of coming together of two quite, we think quite differently in many ways, but at the same time we complemented each other in a really important way, and we got a great deal out of it. I mean, we got great friendship out of it as well. It was an extraordinary kind of collaboration, really. Which,
do you think that's a sort of special to Cambridge or Oxbridge, or?
Well, I think it is actually. I think that I had to give an interview to the people from the Nobel Institute because they were very interested in why it was that places like Oxford and Cambridge were producing so many Nobel Prizes, and I said I thought that dining together was a very important way in which intellectual ideas can start to flow, and you can get this coming together between different disciplines in a way which is much more difficult in universities which are all kind of in their, they're all in their silos, and they don't necessarily meet people in other disciplines, whereas we have this fantastic opportunity to meet people. And I do think actually it is a very, very important part of this place, and I said so in this interview to the Nobel Institute. I thought that they should be grateful for what we do, for actually taking forward ideas which very often develop in the interstices between sort of disciplines, where very interesting things happen, and it's happened again and again in Cambridge.
So you worked with Gabriel. You started working with Gabriel on this imprinting at that point.
Gabriel, I think he went off for a sabbatical to Uganda, and so we didn't start immediately. But then he came back.
That was when he read Watson's double helix, the draft of it. I think perhaps, or at least it was certainly in Africa when Watson came back.
I don't think I knew that. But anyway, I mean, he was waiting. He came back, and then we said, well, let's get started. And we didn't quite know what to measure at that time, and we were trying various things, and we teamed up with a pharmacologist who called Liz Bateson, and we were getting some hints of effect, but it was not very clear, and Les got fed up. He didn't want to go on any longer. He thought it was going nowhere. And then Gabriel and I went down to give seminars to a group that Stephen Rose ran down in London. And we wanted to find some biochemist who was sort of keen to collaborate. And Stephen had been interested in effects of experience on the nervous system. And he was keen to collaborate with us, and that started actually an important period of collaboration between the three of us. And we then designed increasingly complicated experiments, which I think were very important. I mean, I mean, when you try to look for changes in the brain which are associated with experience, there are all sorts of things that can be going on. I mean, the animals may become more active, they may become more stressed, they may become more attentive, they may be more stimulated in all sorts of ways. And if you want to look at whether or not things that you're measuring are actually specifically related to the experience and related to the laying down of the memory, you've got to do a whole series of different kinds of experiments, each of which excludes a different subset of possibilities. And it's this is kind of triangulation approach which we devised, and I still think was actually intellectually very important. I mean, you know, and sometimes when I see people doing work on a neural basis of behaviour, they haven't gone through the rigour of excluding alternative explanations. And the famous example of that is sort of all the imaging that people do, because you don't know whether the things that you're picking up in the brain are upstream or downstream, or side effects of what's going on, and you need to go through the process of excluding alternative explanations. Anyway, we did that. It took us several years, and we finally were able to say pretty confidently that there was an area in the brain which was necessary for laying down of a memory, and specifically related to that. And we then needed to identify it much more precisely. And at that point, Gabriel was moving down to Bristol, and the collaboration between Gabriel and Stephen and me came to an end. But we still wanted very much to try and localise very precisely where this area was. And we developed a technique which I'm still rather proud of, actually. I think it's a very good technique, which is you take two groups of chicks, one of which have been trained for a long time, have learned as much as they're going to learn about the imprinting object, and one which has just started to learn. And then you wait a day, and then you train both groups for the same amount of time. One group has learned everything, and the other group has still got a lot to learn. They're both very active, they're both sort of stimulated in the same way, in exactly the same way. And at that point you introduce your biochemical marker, and then you can kill the animals, slice their brain, and see where activity is occurring.
That.
Using this technique of either undertraining the animal or overtraining it, and then retraining them the next day, we were able to find an area of the brain which was particularly related to the laying down of memory, and that was very important, because once we'd found that area, then you could lesion it, or either before imprinting, which then prevents imprinting, or lesion it afterwards, and you lose the memory. Just a fairly small area, and that then became the basis of a lot of work, some of which I was involved with, some of which I wasn't, which Gabriel built on, and it became a very, very important starting point for a whole program of research. My kind of experience with Timbo and his interest in sort of function was still going on in the back of my mind, and I was sort of asking myself, what can be the function of imprinting? And usually the story given is that animals imprint in order to learn what their species looks like. I developed the thought that what filial imprinting does is enable you to recognise what your mother looks like, or sometimes your father as well, so that you can avoid the hazards of responding in a filial way to somebody who's not your parent. And if you look at ducks on the cam, for example, I mean, you'll see sometimes a lost duckling going up to a female who's not their mother, and the female will attack it. because she doesn't want to be parasitised, so there's a cost to her if she takes on a chick that's not her own. So there seems to be a very good reason why you should actually learn what your mother looks like, and identify her as an individual. But then that's raises the question of what about sexual imprinting, which takes place much later in development. And I developed the argument that what sexual imprinting does is enable you to learn what your close kin look like, and this would be not only your parents but also your siblings. And then when you become adult, you choose a mate who's a bit different, but not too different from your close kin. Because if you mate with your close kin, there's a cost from inbreeding. If you mate with very distantly related individuals, then there's a cost of outbreeding too much. And there are many costs of outbreeding too much. And so I thought it might be a mechanism for where kind of striking an optimal balance between inbreeding and outbreeding. And the only way you can do that is to know what your own kin look like. Anyway, so I developed this argument at a conference, and people got very interested in that. And then I thought, well, I better do some experiments to see whether or not it was correct. And then I built up a quail colony at Maringly, Japanese quail, and I then did experiments where individuals who had grown up with other individuals would not choose them as mates when they were adult. And what in a more careful experiment, what we did was to either rear them with siblings or non-siblings, and then test them with different types of relation afterwards when they were adults. And I had an apparatus where the birds could wander around the outside of one-way screens, and inside the one-way screens would be a sibling that they'd never seen before, a sibling they had seen before, a cousin that they'd never seen before, or a second cousin they'd never seen before. It reminded me a little bit of that part of Amsterdam where all the prostitutes were, when we called it the Amsterdam apparatus. Anyway, the birds would wander around looking through the windows, and the birds inside couldn't see the ones looking at them. Anyway, what I found was, very, very dramatic actually, that they had a very strong preference for the individuals who were their first cousins who they'd never seen before.
Really?
They didn't like their siblings who they'd never seen before, nor did they like the second cousins or the more distantly related individuals. So they had this finely tuned preference, slightly displaced away from their close kin. Now, whether exactly something like that goes on in the wild is another matter, but it certainly indicated that sexual imprinting was having this function of providing a standard, and you could then offset your mating preference from that standard. And that led on to a lot of other work, which...
you presumably, I'm sure we discussed this, and you knew that this is the most common form of marriage in many societies, preferential first cousin marriage.
Yes, and cross cousin rather than parallel cousin.
Yes, that's right.
That's right. Yes, which is very interesting. Yes, indeed. But I didn't like the suggestion which some people made that this was this explained the incest taboo for reasons which you could understand. I thought it was most likely that this was an indirect effect. That what happens in human populations is that people have a distaste for individuals who they've grown up with. There's lots of evidence for that. But that a prohibition developed quite independently of that, or rather as well was built upon that, in the sense that people would not want to do what other people would not want to do, and so it was kind of conforming to what others did, then led to the taboo, rather than that it was sort of that somehow the inhibition led to a prohibition directly. I rather disliked sort of the way in which the work that I did on birds was sort of being taken as the explanation for the incest taboo, which I thought
by Robin Fox and
yeah, I think absolutely. And the other thing that I was developing an interest in was the development of mother-offspring relationships in cats, and also play in cats, because very little sort of good systematic work had been done on play. This is partly because we'd had a man who'd been working at Manly on cats, and he left to go off to St Andrews, and so we had this colony. But I also, I like cats, and we have them at home, and we breed them. So it's sort of.
I remember seeing them. They're very beautiful
Oh,
cats.
they're lovely. Absolutely.
They're Russian and.
Well, we had Russian blues to begin with, and then more recently we've got Egyptian Mars, which are the spotted cats, which are really beautiful cats. They're thought to be the cats which the Egyptians used in their temples, and certainly the temple paintings look very similar to the Egyptian Mars. And the African wild cat is thought to be the ancestor of the domesticated cat. Mm. So it sounds quite plausible. In fact, that was the case. Anyway, I was interested in the kind of developing relationships, and then also the development of play. And there were two very interesting things that came out of that. One was that play is a heterogeneous group of behaviour patterns. I mean, that the play that they do with each other develops much earlier and has a quite different sort of time course from the play that they do with objects, which develops weeks later. So, I mean, it's pretty obvious when you think about human play. It's unlikely that they're all controlled in the same way. But it was very nice to see that emerging very clearly. The other thing which came out of it was that there'd been this idea of parent-offspring conflict, which would be particularly marked at the time of weaning. And I came to feel that this idea, a very, very famous idea, widely accepted by evolutionary biologists, was actually wrong. That there isn't conflict normally at weaning. That if the mother is in bad shape, the offspring pick this up, and they wean themselves, and they're not being kicked off by the mother. They're actually going on to solid food, because if they don't go on to solid food, they can't grow, because the mother isn't able to produce enough milk. And so it's in their own interest to go on to solid food. And conversely, the mother has to be sensitive to the condition of her offspring. And if the offspring are in poor shape, she'll spend much longer looking after them, if she's able to do so, than she otherwise would. And so it seemed to me that actually what was represented as a kind of behavioural conflict at the time of weaning was far from that. It was actually, there was a lot of information going both ways between mother and offspring. And that the kind of the Robert Trivers notion of weaning being the archetypal example of parent-offspring conflict was absolutely wrong. And I think that actually, I think he was wrong. So that sort of led off in a different direction. The other thing which sort of ties into what I'm now currently very interested in is that the ways in which the cats developed was very much dependent on the conditions of the environment, so that they had very different styles of development depending on local conditions. And I mean, the way it's been known about for a century, that many different animals, many different plants will, from the same genotype, will develop very different phenotypes depending on local conditions. And the phenotype that they develop is actually adapted to the conditions which triggered that particular phenotype. And the reason why I sort of got very interested in this later on was I was writing a book about development of behaviour, and I came across work that had been done by a man called David Barker. He was an epidemiologist. And he had got hold of some data from Royston, where a wonderful midwife had been collecting an enormous amount of information about the babies there, the condition of the mother, and also sort of physical things like their weight. And Barker was able to. This midwife was working in London in the early part of the 20th century. And Barker was able to get hold of these data and then see what happened to these people. And it turned out that the small babies were much more likely to get heart disease when they were adult and middle aged than the bigger babies. And I got hold of this and I thought, gosh, this is incredibly interesting. I mean, could it be that in improving economic conditions, the small babies, as it were, have got the wrong weather forecast and they're not well adapted for an affluent environment? And so I wrote to David Barker about this when we started to talk about it, and he got interested in it. And then I went to a series of conferences which he organised, where I presented these ideas, and people got more and more excited about the possibility that in fact it's not pathological what happens here. It's a mismatch between, as it were, the weather forecast that has been given to the offspring and the conditions in which they end up. And if you look at places like India, where you have a very large middle class now, the problem of heart disease and diabetes is epidemic. I mean, vast numbers of people suffering in middle age, born small, and then they end up, in a condition which they're not well used to. And conversely, and this has come out later, but I mean, conversely, if you have people who are big at birth and have all the adaptations for an affluent environment, if they end up in a famine, as has happened in Ethiopia, they suffer because they're poorly adapted for famine conditions, and they're much more likely to get rickets and vitamin D deficiency. So it looks as though it works both ways. And anyway, this has all led on to a lot of experimental work.
Very, very interesting. Something similar was found with demography. You probably know that the size of families that people had in adulthood was not related to their current conditions and so on, but to the conditions when they were children. So if conditions were difficult as children, they would often have small families later on in their lives. So it reflected a generation before. Or
yes. And actually, interestingly, I mean, it looks increasingly that there are sometimes 2, even 3 generation effects taking place here, and this has raised a whole new area of research called epigenetics. So it's transgenerational epigenetics, in which mechanisms by which this can happen are being uncovered, and you don't get any change in the DNA, but what you do get is suppression of some parts of the genes, and some part of the genome, and activation of other parts of the genome, which is appropriate for the kind of environment which those individuals are living in and for their offspring. And when you think about what's happened to humans who are moving around the globe, going from one type of climatic conditions to another, it would be incredibly valuable to have these epigenetic mechanisms which enables them to be adapted to the environment which they've now moved into. And anyway, there's sort of enormous amount of interest in this now, partly because of the public health implications, of course, but also because of just the intrinsic interest of it.
I was wondering when this shift, the earlier one you were talking about, conflict over weaning, in your thinking occurs, because if it was parallel to the shift in thinking about Dawkins' selfish gene, from the selfish gene to the cooperative and altruistic aspect of evolution, yours was another example of that slight mellowing of the view of the selfish gene.
Well, I was always a bit critical of Richard, actually, because there was always kind of a lesion in his thought between the kind of parable of genes with intentions to what genes actually do. And Richard was sort of sometimes expressed as it was sort of like a Necker cube, you saw it one way or the other. I thought that was completely false analogy, actually, and that it misled a lot of people into thinking that genes have this kind of extraordinary deterministic role in development. Richard himself didn't actually think that, but he misled other people into thinking that, and then you see he went on to argue that communication didn't involve transmission of useful information; it simply was manipulation, because the selfish genes were not interested in what anybody else did; they were just interested in sort of in furthering their own cause, as it were, of propagating themselves to the next generation. And so the kind of the parent-offspring conflict idea, which Trivers advanced, sort of was very congenial to a kind of selfish gene point of view.
That's right.
But not a view where it could benefit both parties to actually pass useful information back and forth. So you're absolutely right. I mean, there was a big shift taking place from the sort of era of the selfish gene to ideas, much more constructive ideas about cooperation, and that shift is still taking place. Actually, I mean, there are still people who think that the selfish gene approach is the right one. I think it's not.
Good. Right. So, what is the next adventure, or shall we turn just for a while to kings?
Yes, well, actually, I mean, it is relevant because, I mean, by the sort of mid '80s, I was sort of I'd been around in Cambridge for a long time, and I'd seen how refreshed some of my colleagues had been by moving universities, and I felt I really ought to go somewhere else. And I was I was quite actively sort of looking at places in the States and where I might go to. And then it was suggested to me that I should be a candidate for professorship when Benedict Williams retired. And I wasn't very keen on that, actually. I was a bit sort of reluctant about it, but then I agreed to have my name go forward, and it was a very funny election, actually, because a lot of the younger fellows really wanted to have a provost who came from outside the college, and I think if I'd been them, I would have, I'd been with them, in a sense, and so there was a kind of, it was the young, active fellows of the college wanted to change, and there was a campaign then mounted to bring in a distinguished mathematician as provost. And there was a very it was an aggressive campaign, actually, and I didn't feel, I knew everybody here, and I didn't feel I could campaign. I sort of had my hands rather tied behind my back about this, and I found it actually quite uncomfortable. And I wasn't at all sure, actually, that I'd be elected. In some ways, I kind of rather hoped I wouldn't be, because I didn't want to sort of end up in a kind of divided college. But anyway. As things turned out, when it came to the election, I was just elected. It was by a few votes. It was very small, and there was a lot of ill feeling after that. Actually, it was quite divisive for the college, and I certainly felt it for quite a long time after I was elected. I mean, I quite often had a really difficult time on the governing body with people. They're really out to sort of get me. And that persisted for quite a few years, and it was quite inhibiting, actually, in a way. I felt I couldn't put forward things that I'd like to have put forward because because I knew there would be this body of opinion that would be against whatever I proposed. And it wasn't until really I'm about halfway through my professorship, and things really kind of changed a lot, and then suddenly it became completely different and much easier. But I mean, that said, I mean, the kind of dealings I had with the fellowship were not particularly happy ones at that time. But that said, I mean, it was actually a very, very interesting period for me, because Dusha, my wife, and I had sort of, in a sense, had been kind of living almost sort of separate lives. She'd been bringing up the children, and I'd been sort of getting on with my career, and not, we hadn't been doing that much together. And then, now with the girls growing up,
She had a job at
South
Bateson Studies.
Yes. But it was a part-time job, and she felt that she had to be there for the girls if they were ill or and needed help. But then when I was elected, then we could do this together because actually the job is one that goes on long after we're office hours. I mean, because you're entertaining people. We had a lot of guests coming through the lodge. And she was a marvellous hostess, actually. She was absolutely superb at doing that. And it would continue very often till after breakfast the next day, because we had people staying in the night. But we also met a lot of people who I wouldn't otherwise have met. I mean, the most startling of all these was Princess Margaret. I mean, what was... it was quite funny how it all came about, because shortly after I sort of took up residence in the lodge, Jack Plum came. Jack Plum, a famous historian who had been Master of Christ, came to see me and said, "Would I invite Princess Margaret to the Advent Carol service?" And I said, "Yes, of course." I'm delighted, and so I wrote to Princess Margaret and invited her. Seems a kind of civilised thing to do. And then when she accepted, then Jack Plum came back to me and said, "You realise you'll be staying for the weekend?" My sort of jaw dropped. And anyway, so duly she came, and it was an amazing song and dance. I mean, because she came with a maid and a lady in waiting and detectives and so on, and was quite. She you had to treat her as royalty. I mean, you couldn't sort of treat her as anybody.
You wouldn't say Margaret to her.
No, absolutely not.
What did you call her? Your Highness? Or?
Some sort of calling her anything, actually. It was quite funny, actually, because in a way it was and actually interestingly, I mean, she was a bit nervous about coming into an academic household. She'd never had any formal training. She's a very intelligent woman, but she also found it was slightly awkward. But we gave her a good time, and the members of the choir came and sang to her. She liked the boys, and it was quite a good occasion. But then, I mean, having done it once. Jack would come back and say, "Can she stay with you again?" And we couldn't very well say no. And she came back. I mean, I don't know, 7 times. I think it was extraordinary.
Just to stay.
She would. Jack would usually have a party for her in Christ.
Why couldn't she stay with him?
Because he was no longer master.
Oh, I see.
He hadn't got any in the base, and he found this sucker who would look after her. And actually, I mean, over the years, we got rather fond of her. I mean, she was there was a very nice side to her. Actually.
Did you ever get to her first name terms?
No, I think we did actually. But I mean, I think she became rather fond of us actually, and it was a nice. It became quite a nice relationship. Anyway, so she was perhaps the most remarkable of all the people that we had staying. But we had at one time we had the Dalai Lama staying.
What was he like?
Oh, he was wonderful.
Was he?
Wonderful. An extraordinary warmth about him. And also good intellect. I mean, he on occasion he brought with him 2 monks who were meant to eat with him, and we were told that he wouldn't have any food after midday. I mean, and that his monks would have food, but he wouldn't. Anyway, we'd arranged for them to have a meal in the anteroom of the dining room, and then Dalai Lama said, "I want to talk to you." He dismissed the 2 monks, and so we had their food, and then he asked us whether he could have some of what we were eating, and he said, "Of course." But I said, "I thought you weren't supposed to eat after midday." He said, "I'll say a prayer." Anyway, he was very interested in sort of in science and quizzed us a lot about quizzed me a lot about know what I was doing, and also told us a lot about Tibet and about the whole Lama system. He wasn't actually very keen on the Lama system. He said what he felt was very important was that the culture of Tibet should remain intact. And the Lama system is quite recent. I mean, it's relative to the major part of the culture.
Is it all right to go on the internet, do you think? we might censor this bit.
Well, anyway, I mean, just to finish the story, which I think is very interesting. And he said that when the Chinese moved up there, the women couldn't have their babies. It was at a high altitude, and they had to move down to lower altitudes, and that sort of set me thinking about whether or not there had actually been selection.
You mean the Chinese women couldn't?
The Chinese women, because Tibetan women could, of course. But it made me wonder whether actually over the centuries the Tibetans had actually been selected for being able to survive at higher altitudes. I mean, it might be epigenetic. It might be something that you get very early on in life, but who knows? But maybe the Chinese will be able to adapt.
Worth looking at that. Yeah.
It would be worth looking at, and I haven't actually heard any more.
I've got a lot of friends who work in Tibet, so I'll ask them.
Yeah, no, I'd be interested to know. But anyway, one of the things that we had a question and answer session with the Dalai Lama and students, and this can go on the internet, I think. That he was asked by the students, who did he most admire in the world? And he instantly came back, Gorbachev.
What year was this? 1989?
It was after, yes, it must have been about 1991.
So it was his.
I mean, it was I mean, of course, by that time Gorbachev was very unpopular in the Soviet Union, but or no, former Soviet Union, in Russia. But the Dalai Lama thought that Gorbachev had done more for world peace than anybody. And interestingly, later on, in the sort of later in the 90s, John Barber invited Gorbachev to come to a conference here in King's, and he stayed with us. And when Bukovsky, who you may remember had been persecuted under the Brezhnev era, and he got out from Russia and was a student here. And he stayed on in Cambridge and became very much sort of tied in with extreme right-wing movements. And then he wrote to me sort of saying, it's intolerable that I was going to put up this murderer in the lodge. Because he associated Gorbachev with all the people who persecuted him. And I was able to say to Vladimir Bukovsky, what's good enough for the Dalai Lama is good enough for me. I mean, because it was, and actually, I found Gorbachev fascinating. He didn't speak any English, but he had an interpreter who had been with him for a long time, and who was so quick that you could sort of get the mood of Gorbachev. He's a very humorous man. He's very intelligent, but there's got a great sense of fun about him, and that would come through the interpreter. And one really sort of had a feeling that I was talking the same language. He was very skillful at interpreting. But he was a fascinating man. Tough for him that he was so hated by his compatriots.
The other person who caused the maximum amount of secret police milling around in your garden was Salman Rushdie.
Yes. Well, Salman Rushdie had that fatwa put on him after the Satanic Verses was declared blasphemous, and he went into hiding. And then we heard that he would like to come out of hiding and give an address in the chapel. We had to keep it absolutely secret, but we agreed. And there was an incredible police procedure that went ahead, and they just went through everything, because they were certain that if it became known that Rushdie was here, that somebody would try and shoot him, or live off a bomb or something. So they were incredibly careful. And they went through everything in the chapel. All the litter under the stalls, they went through everything there. And then he was taken by a special car around from the chapel, around West Road, and around Queen's Road and to the lodge. And in the lodge, they'd been going around the garden, looking under every bush in case of a bomb there, and they had dogs. And Daley Rylands, who by that time was in his 90s, looked out and he saw these people going beating dogs around the garden, and he rang up the porters and said, "There's some rough-looking types in the Provost Garden with dogs!" And it was special branch. And then you know, Salman then came for a lunch in the lodge, and lots of people came, but they all had been carefully vetted. And behind every curtain there was an armed special branch. It was amazing, actually. Quite extraordinary.
Amazing. The other thing that you mentioned, particularly I remember about being provost, was sitting in your stall, looking up at the great ceiling bosses.
Yes.
And what did you see when you...
Well, it's interesting, actually. I mean, you know, we used to be told that those bosses, which are kind of spandrels, I mean, you know, they don't serve any function other than decorative, because there's a ring of stones in which they sit, and every altar boss is a Tudor rose, and I discovered that they're not solid. They're actually, if you train an astronomical telescope from underneath at these bosses, you can see that they're split, and they're probably hollow. Anyway, when you look at the rose from the side, they look like an angry old man. So it looks like Jehovah sort of sitting up there, kind of. I must get a sort of decent photograph of it, because once you see it, it's absolutely obvious. So the rose after rose has this kind of angry man looking down. And when I sat there, I'm not a believer, and I sort of thought, you know, I've been scowled at.
You think this is just a coincidence? There's no intention?
I can't.
Because of course there's a lot of playfulness, as you know, with the misericords and many of the...
well, I know, and some of the things which are out of sight and which are very high up, you know, are beautifully carved. There's lots of jokes there. I mean, I can't believe, but it's a wonderful bit of projection, because you could actually, I mean, once you've seen it, you see it all the time.
I'll have to have a look. You mentioned that God might have been scowling down on you. I mean, the provost's role is a very ceremonial, religious role.
Yes.
And I don't know what your own religious faith is, or...
Well, I'm not a believer, but I love to sort
Are you an agnostic or an atheist, would you say?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think when Darwin, his response when he was asked whether he was an atheist was, well, I don't know, so I'm agnostic. I think actually I'm an atheist when all is said and done. I mean, I'm really honest about it, because I really don't believe in a God. I mean,
you know he isn't there.
I don't quite know it, but I mean, I certainly don't believe it. So it's not just a question of not knowing; it's a question of actually not believing. So I think probably if but I always used to call myself an agnostic, but I think actually if I was absolutely honest, I'm an atheist. But that said, of course, I was brought up in kind of CLE tradition, and I love a lot of the ceremony, and of course the music in the chapel was wonderful, I was a great supporter of the choir and of Stephen Cleary, because I felt that this was one of the truly great things about this college, is that side of it. So I had no compunction at all about sort of taking part in those ceremonies, I mean, there would. I guess there would have been people who would have been offended. I mean, there were people I had atheist friends who sort of accused me of hypocrisy, but I didn't really feel that.
It was the atheists, it wasn't the Anglicans who accused you.
Well,
of
I think some of the Anglicans probably too, but I was never actually confronted with that. But I was
Your
always
predecessors, after all, were the same view.
Well, exactly. I mean,
Edmund was not. Was an atheist, and Bernard.
So I don't. I mean, it was. I didn't see any problem about it, and of course it was. I mean, I loved it. It was incredibly beautiful. It was quite funny actually, because I'm not a very good sort of public speaker in the sense that I find it quite difficult to speak slowly, and I know that Stephen and John Drury, who was dean at the time, were a bit worried when my first sort of Christmas Eve carousel was coming around, and I was going to have to do the final lesson, in the beginning was the word, and they said I'd better go to be coached by Daly Rylands on how to speak in the chapel, and I went to Daly and expecting to have some kind of supervision on how to speak. And Daly said, "Deep breathing. That's all. Deep breathing." and actually, he's right, because I mean, if you breathe deeply, your blood pressure goes down, and of course your voice gets stronger, and you do take it at a more sort of deliberate pace. I mean, it's interesting, and I do it now before I give lectures. You know,
I
mean, it really does make a big difference.
Yes, I went to a speech coach, and that was what they said.
Yes, it was
deep
very,
breathing.
very important advice actually. I really benefited from it, and I learned a lot. And the other thing which is very interesting about the chapel, which is that if you go too slowly, you can't. It's unintelligible what you say, and if you go too fast, it's unintelligible. So you have to phrase it. You know, there has to be a kind of sensible phrase and a pause, and a sensible phrase and a pause. And the clergy do it almost without thinking about it. But I mean, you know, those of us who are not used to it, we have to kind of learn that. But it's an important trick.
What did you enjoy most about being a provost? There were things that you found very difficult, but apart from meeting Princess Margaret and one or two people, which was interesting, were there other things that you liked?
Well, I mean, meeting people was actually incredibly interesting and important, and actually, when I had to take on more of the role of the fundraiser, which became more and more important as time went on, that meant quite a lot of travel in the States and meeting absolutely delightful people actually. So there were aspects of the role which I liked very much. Also, in the sort of second part of my apprenticeship, I instituted the provost seminars, which were also, I thought, very good, because we got all the students who wanted to come and the fellows who wanted to come, and we would get 2 or 3 speakers, and everybody would be put into groups, which they and then after the talks and the groups had a meal together, and then they went off into a room in Gibbs and discussed a question which they were given about the talks, and then came back, and one of the students would usually be given the job of sort of saying how we'd answered the question. But that was an extraordinarily interesting thing to do. I mean, it was a very it brought different parts of the college together, and we had some marvellous speakers too. I mean, they were very good occasions, and so I enjoyed that very much. Also, Dusha and I used to have musical evenings in the lodge, which were very successful, and the students did all the organising of the music, and we would then sort of give them a sort of meal and wine afterwards. And they were great fun. Enormously enjoyable, and we got to know particularly the musicians very well. one of the changes that occurred during my kind of career as a behavioural biologist was a increasing rigour in the way that people. And I had a very, very bright graduate student who they came back to Cambridge for a while as a postdoc, and we did a book together called Measuring Behaviour, which has now gone into 3 editions.
And this was with
Paul Martin,
that's right.
and it's been a very successful book. In fact, you know, it's a kind of how to do it book, but it sort of explains it in straightforward terms. And I think it was important because it captured a change that was taking place in my subject over that time, where people got increasingly kind of careful about how they measured and how the experiments and so forth. The downside of it was that it's very easy to measure things in a kind of trivial way, and stop focusing on the big questions. And so, at the same time as I was doing this, I was also editing a series, which was with a man called Peter Klopfer, where we were trying to encourage people to actually let their hair down a bit and not be constrained too much by kind of tight methodology. And so these 2 strands going on at the same time, which were actually quite interesting. And we invited essays for this series, and sometimes we paid for it because we would get these things which were almost sort of incomprehensible. And we were sort of torn between, do we actually start to edit these things and make them more coherent, or do we, as it were, do what we said we promised to do to allow them kind of much more free rein? We kind of struck a balance between these 2 things, but there were those 2 very interesting things going on at the same time. There were I had loads of very, very able students going through. I mean, in addition to Paul, and at that time, particularly in the 70s, there were lots of people coming back from the field, like people like Tim Brock and Richard Wrangham and many others, and very interesting postdocs coming through, and I had marvellous research assistants, and one, of course, is Prill Barrett, who's married to Gabriel Horn, and she was the one who did work with me on playing cats, and then we collaborated on some other things, and then of course went off with her wonderful career as a wildlife artist. But
and you mentioned Nick Humphrey.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, and Nick was a great friend and tremendously stimulating person. Who he'd been a student of Larry Weisskranz, has been gone with Larry Weisskranz to Oxford, and then I remember he rang up.
How do you spell Weisskranz?
Weisskranz, sorry, Weiskrantz, Weisskranz. And he rang me up from Oxford and said there was a job going and should he apply for it? And I said yes, because I thought it'd be great, because Nick is such a stimulating man, and he got the job, and was managing me for quite a few years. He felt, and he was doing lovely work, and you know, we all loved having him there. He's such a stimulating man, and he increasingly felt that only 1 or 2 people would read his papers, and what he wanted to do was to actually engage a much larger audience. And he said, I want to get involved in television. And unmistakenly, I think, he sort of gave up his university job so that he could go and make the series of films for television, which actually, in the end, were not terribly well done, I think. I mean, it wasn't his fault, it was the producers who actually made a mess of it, I think. And then, of course, Nick had lost his job, and he had quite difficult time sort of clawing his way back into the academic world as a result of that, and that was a great shame. Because, I mean, in a book that Lord Nutheim and I edited, which had a sort of series of essays sort of celebrating 25 years since Mattingly had been established, Nick wrote a wonderful chapter called The Social Function of Intellect, which is by far and away the most cited chapter in that book, and started kind of a whole new field really of why is it that the human brain develops so rapidly, and what is the function of consciousness, and a question which hasn't yet been answered. But I mean, it was just sort of a characteristic of Nick that he stimulated so many people in that way, and he's a wonderful colleague and a great friend.
One other very large role which we should touch on is that I think it must have been about the middle of the time you were provost, you were made biological secretary of the Royal Society.
Yeah, I mean, actually, prior to that, I've been doing a study for the National Trust on the hunting of red deer by hounds, and I got into it in a rather kind of funny way, because I think they thought I would come to do a whitewash, I think, and I said, well, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it properly. And anyway, so I did the study, and I reported to the National Trust. Great secret. The press were dying to get hold of my report, and so I had it printed by the people who print the examination papers in the old schools. So that's about as good a security as you get. And it was shipped down to the National Trust, and we had a press conference, and the National Trust had their council the next day. And on the strength of my report, they immediately banned hunting of red deer with hounds. They've got headline news, and then I became the object of hatred, of course, among hunting people, and they did their utmost to try and kind of ruin my reputation. And just at that time, I was elected to become biological secretary of the Royal Society. It was a big role, I enjoyed that job, actually. Of all the administrative jobs I've done, I think that was what I enjoyed most of all, because I could really start to contribute to making the Royal Society a much more positive body for getting science across to the public, and I did a lot. I worked a lot.
Who was president at the time?
Aaron Klug was president when I joined, and then he was succeeded by Bob May. And Aaron, in his quiet way, did a lot.
What was he like? Because I've just interviewed.
I'm very fond of him. I mean, he's quite a shy man, actually, and it doesn't really relish, a public profile.
He refused the first time he told me. The first person who'd done it refused.
I'm not surprised, actually. I mean, he is quite self-effacing in that way, but I mean, a wonderful man. And then Bob May, quite different. I mean, absolutely outgoing Australian, very rude, very very funny, and very good actually at projecting science as well as himself. Anyway, so I think we did a lot in that time to actually make the Royal Society a place where people would come to for help about scientific matters. There's one thing that I'm rather proud of, which actually I did when I was biological secretary, was I had to sit on all the sort of sectional committees which deal with candidates for fellowship of the Royal Society, and I was a bit worried about what was obviously sort of tactical voting taking place, because what would happen was you get a shortlist, and there'd been a lot of discussion of these candidates, and sometimes you could see people putting the person who was obviously recognised as being the best at the bottom of their list, so that they could further the chances of somebody that they liked. And I thought this was wrong, and so I decided to institute a new procedure, which was that when they had their shortlist, and they'd rank ordered them, and they had to sign the list, and then I entered the ranks and the person who'd done them onto a spreadsheet, which was then projected, so everybody could see how everybody else had voted.
Wow!
And it actually had a wonderful effect. It made people honest. I mean, it's a well-known principle. People don't want to be seen to be kind of dishonest when it comes to. And actually, I think he did a lot for sort of improving the transparency of that process. And initially, it was just done by the biologists, but then my counterpart, the physical secretary, who initially said, "Oh, we don't have this problem on our side," then he adopted the procedure as well. So I was very proud of that.
Cleaned up the Royal Society.
Yes, that's right. But I mean, it's kind of obvious. So,
Yes, I think the British Academy may follow shortly.
I hope so.
Can we just go back finally to one or two? Well, we haven't talked about the Department of Zoology. You became head.
Well, when Gabriel Horn retired, he had to have somebody who would look after the department because he became Master of Sydney, and he didn't want to become to hold both jobs. And I agreed to take it over, and it was very, very much kind of as a sort of short term. I was Provost of King's at that time, so it was going to be a big job. And I thought it wouldn't be for very long, but then we had a candidate from the States who everybody wanted.
Was Jared Darman?
Yes, it was Jared Darman. And Jared, I think, wants to come, but he couldn't make up his mind because the pension arrangements are so much worse here in Cambridge than they were in Caltech, where he is. And he did it, and he did it, and it went on and on and on, and then eventually he decided that he wouldn't come. And so we then had to go back, go get the electors together again, and came up with another name. And this woman was immediately offered more money by her own university, and having kind of said she would come, then turned us down. So the whole process of election of a new professor of zoology took a long time, and meanwhile I was having to run the department. And actually it was quite funny because the contrast between the Department of Zoology and King's was absolutely priceless, because I'd run a meeting in the zoology department, and it would be very businesslike, and we'd get through the business quickly, and people wanted to get back to their labs. They didn't want to sort of spend time discussing things for too long. But it was, there were good meetings. And then I come over here to King's, and the whole feeling was quite different, because you would have discussion, and you'd get to a point where you think you had some sort of consensus, and then somebody who'd been quiet up to that point would sort of throw in a hand grenade and shatter the kind of consensus, and so you had to kind of start all over again, and the discussion, which you thought was more or less coming to an end, would then take another half hour or something, and it happened again and again. So it was a complete difference of cultures, and it was very funny to sort of go have them back to back, as it were, like that. And I guess people who don't have their labs to get back to, if they
time on their hands.
well, if they decided to have an afternoon on a committee, it might as well be the whole afternoon.
I've noticed that feeling. You've been Provost of King's, and before you said that it was Noel who wrote to you to offer you. So you must have known Noel, Edmund, and Bernard very well.
Yes.
Can you say something just very briefly about those three provosts?
Well, Noel, when I was an undergraduate, sort of seemed incredibly grand, and actually he wasn't terribly interested in the students. When I became a fellow, and actually more especially when I became provost much later on, Noel became an incredibly good friend. I mean, he was a really delightful person, but behind his sort of rather pompous manner, he was an extraordinarily sensitive and nice person, and actually a very important provost too. I mean, he got things like the research centre going, and so I really came to appreciate it, having sort of initially thought of him as being a kind of a very difficult and distant person, far too grand for a place like this. But actually, he wasn't grand at all. I mean, he was actually much more kind of uncertain about himself than you might have guessed if you'd sort of seen this sort of, the way he performed sometimes in public. So I mean, I got very, very fond of Noel, actually, and I liked him enormously. Edmund too, actually, in a very different sort of way. I mean, he was very helpful to me, actually, because quite often we were talking about sort of issues to do with the relationship between the sciences and anthropology. We used to have very interesting discussions, and also on the whole business of the whole nature-nurture issue, which has occupied me a lot in my professional writing. It was very good to talk to Edmund about that, and I always had very good relations with him. Interestingly, towards the end of his professorship, he was very torn about whether he should actually give up, and so he appointed a committee of 3 to give him advice on when he should retire. And the 3 were Bernard Williams, myself, and Ross Harrison.
3 future scholars.
and I mean, fun enough, I mean, some people said that at the time, that there are 3 future scholars. It's extraordinary. Anyway, we gave Edward advice about when he should retire, which he wasn't very pleased about, actually.
Which was fairly soon.
but he took the advice. Anyway, and they left. But I mean, like everybody who knew him, I mean, you could sort of see Edmund getting terribly irritated with things and full of tension sometimes. But again, very fond of him. And then Bernard, of course, was completely different, totally different style. In a way, quite. He was not prepared to put up with people sort of developing kind of inchoate arguments. You know, they had to be very clear, or he lost patience very quickly. I mean, very quick, very intelligent, but he could be quite difficult, actually. I mean, when he was sort of being, he got into sort of slight sort of bullying with it sometimes. You know, when he lost patience with people. Again, I mean, my relations with him were good. It was really Bernard who persuaded me to take over as provost. I mean, I really wasn't particularly keen to him, and he tried to get me to do it, and succeeded. You know, I'm obviously grateful to him for that, and actually I had when he ceased to be provost and then became very ill, and would come back from time to time. I got enormously fond of him again. It was very interesting, actually. You know, sometimes we don't sort of see people in that true personality until you sort of get to know them in a different sort of context, and that was the same with Bernard too. I mean, but a very different kind of relationship from the ones I had with the other 2.
So if you were advising a young scientist,
I mean, I have young students who don't decide to go into an academic career because they think it's going to become a drudge. And in some ways it has for some scientists. It has become they become managers, and they don't enjoy it any longer. But the ones who manage to kind of get back to their enjoyment of it are the ones who I think are the ones who've done really well.
And you've enjoyed it.
I've enjoyed it. I mean, you know, there are times when I've had to do other things, but I mean, and now I'm relieved of all my kind of committee work. I think it's lovely. It's great.
In a lovely house with a lovely family.
Yeah.
And cats.
And cats.
Thank you very much indeed, Pat.